Thank you all for joining us this evening for this evening's lecture by Dr. Mary McAuliffe. We're delighted that so many of you have turned up for the first in our lecture series, the Oak Room lecture series. And for those who are interested in the diverse range of talks that we have programmed this year, you can see the first four have been are available up here. And we've only booked arranged the talks until June, and then again there's a break for the summer, and then there's a further 5 talks in the autumn. And each talk will be open for bookings a month before the date of the talk itself. And as you can see, it's a very diverse range of talks covering a broad range of topics. You can see the full schedule and display on the screen, as I said. Our goal in the series is to amplify diverse voices, offer fresh perspectives on familiar stories, and bring attention to those stories that remain untold. And we also aim to highlight groundbreaking research and new publications that deepen our understanding of Dublin's social, built, and cultural heritage. The series is an initiative of the Dublin City Strategic Heritage Plan and is made possible through grant funding from the Heritage Council's County Heritage Plan grant scheme. Before I introduce Dr. McAuliffe, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge those who have made this evening possible. First, a huge thanks to my colleague Abigail O'Reilly, whom you'll have met at the back of the room, for her hard work in helping to organise this series. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Bernadette Ferguson, who is providing Irish Sign Language interpretation for us tonight, ensuring that everyone can be fully engaged in the event. And a special thanks to Lord Mayor Councillor Madeleine and the wonderful staff of the Mansion House for graciously hosting us in this fantastic venue. Now to our speaker. Dr. Mary McAuliffe is probably no stranger to many of you. She's an historian and lecturer in gender studies at UCD. Her recent publications include the diaries of Kathleen Lynn, appropriately, a life revealed through personal writings, which is co-authored by Harriet Wheelock. And this book, as you will probably have gathered, is for sale at the back of the room with UCD Press. Mary is also the author of Mary Skinner, a biography, which was published in 2020. And she's the co-editor with Jennifer Redmond of The Politics of Gender and Sexuality in Modern Ireland, a reader also published with UCD Press last year, and is currently completing her forthcoming book, Gender and Sexual Violence in the Irish War of Independence and Civil War from 1919 to 1923. Dr. Mary McAuliffe is past president of the Women's History Association of Ireland and an active member of both the Humanities Institute in UCD and the Women's Museum Advocacy Group. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary McAuliffe to the podium.
Thank you all for coming out tonight to hear about the great Dr. Kathleen Lynn. And in fact, she would have attended many events here in both the Round Room and here in the Oak Room. It brings to mind one particular event she talked about towards the end of her life. I think it was in the Round Room at Cayley, at which she felt like a ghost because the young generation didn't know her anymore and nobody was really talking to her. And she was remembering all the people that had gone before her, which is a bit poignant, but also indicates how long she lived and how active she was. But I don't think there's anyone really who doesn't know who Dr. Kathleen Lynn was and is anymore. Myself and Harriet were delighted to play a small part in bringing Dr. Lynn to people's knowledge. And in many ways, we have to question why we have to continue doing this sort of work, this type of research of recapturing and rewriting women back into history, and particularly the histories of women and the rising and women in the border revolutionary movement, and indeed in their afterlives on into the Irish Free State. And their involvement in what Countess Markievicz said were the 3 great movements of Ireland: the labour movement, the women's movement, and of course the cause of Ireland. And it has been a process of constant recovery, rewriting, reiteration over the last 40 years from the 1980s onwards. And this all begs the question why, after 40 years of scholarship, women's roles in the revolutionary period and in the revolutionary afterlives on into the Irish Free State and Republic, why does the male-centric narrative and the concurrent airbrushing of some women, and the work of women historians, indeed, remain so defiantly lodged in public memory? In 2016, during the Decade of Centenaries and the commemoration of the Easter Rising, interest demonstrated by the public in hearing about women's roles and contributions was visibly heightened by several public history projects, including one I was involved in myself at Richmond Barracks, the 77 women who were arrested after the Easter Rising, of whom Dr. Lynn was one. And yet, I'm sorry to say that the quilt, which was the result of that project, is no longer in Richmond Barracks because they couldn't guarantee it's a safe home there. It is now in Lisburn Linen Centre in Northern Ireland, so you need to go all the way up the north to see it. So why does that keep happening? And we have to ask those questions. Yet we persevere, those of us who are interested in women and women's contribution to Irish history in whatever period it is. In 1992, Professor Maria Luddy wrote, "We need biographies of women. In looking at the lives of individual women, we must investigate the connections that existed between their public and private worlds," which I will talk to you about tonight. And did these women create networks of support for their activities? What do they think about society and women's position in it? How were their worldviews formed? And indeed, Dr. Lynn had a lot to say about all of that. So I hope to bring some of her words to you tonight. Recently, last year, Harriet Wheelock and I, Harriet Wheelock, who's the archivist of the Royal College of Physicians, which holds Kathleen Lynn's papers and her diaries, we published this book on the selected extracts of the diaries of Kathleen Lynn with an extended biography and an introduction to the diaries. Lynn was one of a handful of revolutionary women who actually leave an archive for us. To give you an idea of the task, the diaries commence in 1916, so it's obvious she was very aware that they were doing something really important. They commence about a week before the Rising. She'd never kept a diary up to then. So she is aware they're doing something historic that's going to leave a legacy and a mark. So they start in 1916 and continue almost daily until her death in 1955. She stops writing in them maybe about 5 months before her death. They cover her involvement in 1916, the War of Independence, the Civil War, and the formative 4.5 decades of the Irish Free State and Irish Republic, 1922 to 1955. These are the diaries. And she writes them in a very peculiar way. Each line is a day, so it would be a day in 1919, as you can see, and then that same day in 1920 and 21. So at the end of her life, when she was writing in 1955, it was very easy for her to reflect back on what was happening in that day in 1916. And you can see that impact on her memory, and she talks so much about her old comrades in the last couple of years of her life. And as well as her political and feminist activities, also I want to say they had been transcribed by the time we got to them, so I didn't really have to read that. As well as her political and feminist activities, the diaries cover her medical work, the 1918-19 flu pandemic, the establishment of St. Ultan's Hospital for Sick Infants in 1919, and the fight against TB in Ireland. Her interest in child-centred education is well documented in the diaries. She brought Maria Montessori to Ireland in 1930 and introduced a Montessori ward to the hospital. The diaries also provide an insight into her social and political life, her relationship with many of the key political figures of the time. And yes, there was a network of women who all supported each other and continued to support each other through the post-revolutionary period, where women found themselves in a country that was a cold house for women, particularly radical women. The diaries are also revealing of this difficult road, which viewed in the Irish Free State, which viewed women through the constraining lenses of marriage, motherhood and domesticity only. Women like Lynn were regarded and often treated as threats to the establishment. The diaries are also revealing of the support of networks of political women who worked together for social and political change long after the revolution was over. They cover her family and personal relationships, particularly her lifelong relationship with fellow suffragists, revolutionary and social campaigner Madeleine French-Mullen. And this is all I want to talk about you tonight, about this wonderful woman. So who was Kathleen Lynn? I think a lot of you could give me an answer about who was Kathleen Lynn, but I want to go deep into who she was before she becomes Dr. Lynn, and then Dr. Lynn, the revolutionary, and then Dr. Lynn, the doctor. She was born in 1874 in Mullafarney in County Mayo, the second oldest daughter of Robert Lynn, a Church of Ireland clergyman, and his wife, Catherine. Her life of service was not without influence from her own family. Her mother included almsgiving and visiting the poor as part of her philanthropic activities. And as Maeve Warren noted in her short life of Lynn, Lynn vividly recalls the poverty she saw as a young child in Mayo. There would have been minor famines in the west of Ireland in this period as well, and she would have seen that poverty. Her other biographer, Margaret O'Hugerty, suggests that Lynn's Mayo childhood, where poverty coincided with land agitation, the land war started soon after she was born, may have motivated her to seek political and pragmatic solutions to socio-economic deprivation later in life. Another place which I think we really need to acknowledge where her ambitions were nurtured was Alexandra College. Alex, as it was more commonly known, which she attended from 1891. Alex had been founded in 1866, led in pioneering education for women in Ireland. From an early age, Lynn had ambitions to become a doctor, and she had received her medical degree from the Catholic University. But I think we need to look back at Alex and the ambitions that were fostered there. In Alex, she was exposed to the activities of the Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association, which was not a militant suffrage organisation, more a letter-writing and lobbying campaign. And its leader, Anna Haslam, often visited the girls. As well as hearing about the right to vote, the Alex girls were encouraged to think about issues like poverty, prison reform, employment for women, housing, nothing new under the sun, Irish language, history and culture. This was very much in keeping with the ideologies of middle-class suffrage activities in the 19th and early 20th century before militancy came along, which included this long tradition of female philanthropy, that being one of the few female routes into a public world. Alex suited Kathleen Lynn. She blossomed there, coming second in the Stern Scholarship in 1892 and matriculating in 1893 to the Royal University of Ireland exams. Alex also celebrated Lynn before 1916, maybe not so much the revolutionary, but certainly the medical scholar, applauding her success in the first year RUI exams when she came first in practical anatomy. In December 1898, the Alex magazine reported her victory as one of the most gifted women student doctors in the country when she won the Baker Anatomical Prize awarded by the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland. She was an alumnus to be proud of. However, by the early 1900s, you can see politics was beginning to creep into her life. Not only was she succeeding in her medical career, she was becoming more active in suffrage campaigning. In 1903, influenced by her old friends Thomas and Anna Haslam, she became a member of the IWSLGA. They were not given to short organisational names that time, and remained on its executive until 1913, which is interesting because this is the more conservative of the suffrage organisations. They were very disapproving of the militancy of Hannah Sheaf, Skeffington and others, and indeed Lynn herself, but she does remain on their executive until 1913. And one of the reflections she does towards the end of the life, which became as a surprise to me on reading the diaries, she talks about being a soft unionist in the early 1900s, which I hadn't realised, but of course it makes sense. She's the daughter of a Protestant clergyman related to some aristocratic landed families, educated in Alex. It certainly wasn't a place for militant republicanism was discussed. So she does talk about being a soft unionist. So you can see the progression from feminism to cultural nationalism, then on into socialism and militant republicanism. And that evolution is very interesting to track. By about 1906, she says she's quite attracted to the more militant side of suffrage activism. She also became involved in campaigning for her fellow doctors. By 1911, there were 42 female medical practitioners in Dublin, and some of these women doctors met under the auspices of the Irish Association of Registered Medical Women. As historian Laura Kelly notes, I think I should have gone, oh no, it's fine. As well as providing a community for the women, the association campaigned for the vote for women, arguing that women demonstrated that they were equal to men through the employment of medical women in connection with prisons, schools, public health, and the post office. We know that between November 1911 and at least 1915, Lynn was involved with and indeed had become the secretary of the association. While the association does not seem to have met very regularly, Kelly also notes it suggests there was a sense of community or network among these early doctors in Dublin. That's very important for the foundation of St. Ultan's. It also demonstrates that activism was part of Lynn's life from an early age, and demonstrates that she was concerned with women's position in society, and this inevitably led to her involvement in militant suffrage activism. So by 1912, along with her friend Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, she was among those Irish suffragists who campaigned, unsuccessfully at the time, to have female suffrage included as part of the Third Home Rule Bill. The men, John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party, didn't want to upset the Tories particularly, or the more conservative in the British government, by including suffrage for women in Ireland when it wasn't being granted in England, so they didn't let it in. And they would live to regret that, because most of these women campaigned for Sinn Féin in 1918 when they had the vote, and not the Irish Parliamentary Party. And I would argue they did have an impact on delivering that sweeping electoral victory for Sinn Féin in 1918. By 1913, Lynn's activism began to take a militant turn, and a more radical turn, particularly after the failure to include the women in the Third Home Rule Bill. She becomes the medical examiner to the imprisoned suffragettes, some of them imprisoned in Mountjoy Jail, and then when the government realised that was making propaganda for the suffragists, they sent them all down to Tullamore Jail, figuring it would take a lot of effort to get down and protest outside that, but they didn't reckon on the railway system in Ireland, and the women went and protested. She replaced Dr. Eliza Tennant, who was ironically going to become one of the women she worked with in St. Ultan's, who was considered not supportive of militant suffragism. By now, Lynn had also become engaged with the national movement through her friendships with Helena Maloney and Countess Markievicz, who was a distant cousin by marriage. Maloney, described by Lynn as a very attractive and a clever girl with tremendous power of making friends, is said to have introduced her to the ideas of advanced nationalism. And in 1913, that other great event, the lockout, you find that Lynn is having much sympathy with the striking workers, joined Markievicz, Maloney and other activists in the soup kitchens of Liberty Hall. And at this stage, she is socialist in her politics. She's militant in her suffrage politics, and you can see that shift, that movement towards militancy in terms of the fight for Irish freedom. In Liberty Hall, she worked with middle and working class women, Delia Larkin, Sheehy Skeffington, Markievicz, as well as many young inner city working class girls who had been locked out from Jacob's factory, including people like Jenny Shanahan, Bridget Davis, who would go on to become a nurse in St. Ultan's, of course Rosie Hackett, of whom the bridge is named. And she would remain a staunch supporter all her life of the Irish Women's Workers' Union, whom she helped reorganise after the 1916 Rising. During the lockout, she worked in the food kitchen and oversaw dietary rations, ensuring that the food met the standard that they were giving the starving people, that it was worthy of keeping them alive, body and soul together. She also came under the influence of a man there. It's been all women up to now, but there's one man who was a very strong influence of her, and I guess you can guess who that was. That was James Connolly, a self-declared feminist and socialist. It was no surprise then that Lynn would find her home for her developing nationalism, not in Cumann, but in Connolly's more egalitarian Irish Citizen Army. And it is the Irish Citizen Army that she fights the Rising with. During this time, from 1913 on, she's exposed to the extreme poverty of workers and their families and living in the tenements. And it's here too that she meets her lifelong partner, Madeleine ffrench-Mullen. She joined the Citizen Army at its formation and became its chief medical officer. Connolly was a real influence on her developing socialist ideals, and he was said to have been very impressed with her. telling his family, the most amazing of them all is Dr. Lynn, that she, with her early training and environment, would find her niche in the citizen army, to be so thoroughly at home and to be so completely accepted by them is something to be constantly amazed at. As Chief Medical Officer of the ICA, she conducted first aid classes to mixed classes of men and women, as was the egalitarian ideology of the ICA, in Liberty Hall, and it was under her tutelage that many of the women, and indeed men, who participated in 1916 learnt their first aid skills. Quite a few of these women would work for her later in St. Ultan's. She also taught first aid to the women of Cumann, and it was at a first aid meeting in Harcourt Street in the Cumann headquarters that she actually meets Madeleine ffrench-Mullen in 1914. They move in together shortly afterwards, and they would live together then for the rest of their lives. In the weeks prior to 1916, she was active in preparations for the coming insurrection. She was one of the few women with a car, but also one of the few women trusted with details of what was going to happen. The other being Markievicz, of course, and Margaret Skinner was another one of those. Lynn often collected and delivered guns and ammunition, although she did state it was not until Sunday that she knew fully what was going to happen and where she would be stationed in the rising. On Easter Monday, Lynn and Markievicz went to City Hall in her car, which was filled with materials, first aid and arms and ammunition. There it was unloaded by the ICA women, and many of them climbed to the top of City Hall. She remembered it in her diaries as a beautiful day. The sun was hot. But tragedy soon struck when Sean Connolly, the commandant of the ICA garrison in City Hall, was shot and fatally wounded. And it was in Lynn's arms that he died. She says in her diaries, the minute she saw the wound, she knew it was fatal. He was hit in the head. The beautiful day was soon filled with the sound of bullets, but as Nora O'Connelly O'Brien later recalled, the remaining citizen army combatants were comforted by the quiet, authoritative manner of Dr. Lynn. Many told of her calmness, while on the roof of City Hall, with bullets smacking all round her, she straightened and covered the body of Sean Connolly. City Hall was soon surrounded by British soldiers. It was easy to take. They had no defence against the intruders. And as Lynn recalled, the bullets fell like rain. The firing came from all sides and continued till after darkness fell. There was no way to escape. Soon after, the City Hall garrison surrendered. So her rising lasted just the day, about 8 or 10 hours. And Lynn and all the combatants were arrested and marched to Ship Street Barracks, which is at the back of Dublin Castle, where they remained until the rising ended. So she was in prison from Easter Monday until after the women were released from Kilmainham. The conditions in Ship Street were grim, the food was bad, and the sanitary conditions unhygienic. The blankets they were given were crawling with lice, and they were all put into a large room, which seemed to be underground because they could see people passing above through a grating. Lynn said they got a good dinner on the first day, but as the days wore on, the food got worse and worse. The conditions in the room were horrible. Maloney wrote that they had to sleep on these old bits of mattresses used by soldiers. They were covered in vermin, and before the day had passed, they were all covered in lice too. They were given grey blankets, also covered in lice, and the scratching was not so bad in the daytime, Lynn writes, but at night time it was perfectly awful. The sanitary conditions were primitive, and they were escorted by soldiers to use the lavatories, and there was no door on them, so they had to do their private things in the full view of soldiers, and the women found this lack of privacy very difficult to accept, and many of them talked about that afterwards as a type of violence, the male gaze on them. Much to their relief, when the rising ended, the women in Ship Street were taken to Richmond Barracks first and then transferred to Kilmainham Jail. There, Lynn shared a cell with Madeleine ffrench-Mullen and Helena Maloney. Her delight at finding ffrench-Mullen is reflected in the diary because they didn't know where each other was. ffrench-Mullen spent the rising in the Royal College of Surgeons, so they didn't know if the other were dead or alive, so they were delighted to find each other. They found Kilmainham very harrowing, as they could hear the executions of the leaders taking place. After most of the women were released, Lynn and 11 other women were transferred to Mountjoy Jail, and then Madeleine, or she writes in her diary, Mountjoy was cleaner than Kilmainham, so she said Mountjoy better than Kilmainham, but I would give £10,000 for Kilmainham and Madeleine. Again, an early indication of the real connection between these two women. She was then deported to Bath in England, but she soon returned to Dublin, where she continued her general practice, but no hospital would now employ her. She was a rebel, and she had a very bad mark against her. She continued her public activities, and in 1917 she was elected to the Sinn Féin executive, not without a fight. The women had to set up a group called the League of Women Delegates to force Sinn Féin to actually keep to its promises of equality and have women on its national executive. They wanted more than they got, but they got 6 women elected to the national executive. She participated in ceremonies to mark the first anniversary of the Rising, including a march on O'Connell Street, and she was watched by the authorities and was on the run between May and October 1918, when she was arrested and sent to Arbour Hill. But by this time, of course, the flu pandemic had broken out, and the Lord Mayor of Dublin, who would have been in this very building, or in the building next door, Lawrence O'Neill said, got up a petition to save Lynn from deportation, calling her as an innocent as a newborn babe, which obviously wasn't true. But they wanted her and her medical expertise as the flu swept across Ireland in 3 waves: mild in the spring of 1918, lethal in the autumn of that year, and moderate in early 1919. The public authorities were called on to recognise their services, to reorganise their services at once, and to be active and alert to the flu pandemic. It was acknowledged that the 90-year-old Sir Charles Cameron, Superintendent of Public Health, lacked the energy and physical powers necessary to deal with the tasks, so doctors like Lynn needed to step up. She called for returning soldiers to be quarantined, as in Australia, and their uniforms fumigated to avoid infecting family and friend, as she felt that the front in Flanders was a factory of fever. And in this she was not wrong. Operating out of a house, which was the initial hospital, and also out of Liberty Hall, and in a tenement area around East Wall in the north inner city, she did her best to combat the flu. She describes this in her Bureau of Military History witness statement. She said, "We admitted patients suffering from flu. At the time, I had got from Dr. Crofton some vaccine, which we used successfully in a couple of flu cases in the previous May. When the epidemic broke out again, I got a supply of the vaccine, and in one night we went to Liberty Hall. The whole of the citizen army was there, over 200 of them, and we inoculated them with this vaccine. When the epidemic was over, we closed the hospital for the time being." And that hospital was in Charlemont Street, and that building would go on to become St. Ultan's Hospital for Sick Infants. This excerpt demonstrates what flu historian Ida Milne has noted as Lynn's early and energetic support of vaccination. She was enthusiastic about the use of the Crofton vaccine, saying it was successful both as a preventative and as a curative. Despite Lynn's enthusiasm, it wasn't that effective, but it did help a bit. Milne says about 14% of those she inoculated caught the disease mildly, whereas 44% of the uninoculated caught it very severely. So it did help. Others were less enthused about using a vaccine that had not been fully tested in a lab. So perhaps COVID is not the first time this happened. While Lynn was thoroughly engaged with her medical work, she was committed also to her political activities with Sinn Féin. And as I said, they set up the League of Women Delegates to make sure the political movements in Ireland operate in the interests of Irish women, as had been promised in the proclamation, and ensure all women would be represented on Sinn Féin. While her political activities were important, it is her life of service as a doctor that I want to concentrate on for this bit. In 1919, along with Madeleine ffrench-Mullen as administrator and several other doctors, she set up Ireland's first hospital for sick infants, St. Ultan's, on Charlemont Street. It opens its door in 1919 with 2 cots, £70 and a goat. And the goat is important because, of course, goat's milk. She knew that some children couldn't drink the dairy milk, so goat's milk was very important for that. It was, as Ruan says, a place where Lynn could deliver her feminist, Christian and socialist, Republican ideals. The women were horrified at the high infant and maternal mortality rates in Dublin, as well as the high rates of TB in the city, particularly the city tenements. In St. Ultan's, which was staffed mainly by women, they were committed to research on TB eradication, eventually pioneering the BCG vaccination in the hospital in the 1930s with her St. Ultan's colleague, Dr. Dorothy Stopford Price. Again, quoting Rowan, Lynn's love of radical ideas and innovation did not stop with politics and medicine. As a hospital doctor, she commissioned young architect Michael Scott to design the outpatients unit, which became his first public building. St. Ultan's flats were built to house former slum tenements. Her commitment to treating the whole child led her to introduce the world's first Montessori unit, which was visited by Dr. Maria Montessori in 1934. Lynn believed that a child should be hugged. And often you have these images of Lynn with babies in her arms. And those who worked with her always talk about that. She walked around the hospital, there were always babies and infants trailing after her or held in her arms. And she believed in treating the whole child, not just the symptoms or the disease, but the whole child, emotionally, psychologically, their brain, as well as their illness. Going back to the political Lynn, she worked through the War of Independence. She was active in the Civil War. She opposed the Treaty of 1921. On hearing the details of the treaty, her diary entry for the 7th of December 1921 reads, "Peace terms, but such a peace, not what Connolly," interesting, "not what Connolly and Mallon and countless others died for. Please God, the country won't agree to what Griffin, Barton, Gavin Duffy, Duggan and Mick Collins have put their name to. More shame to them. Better war than such a peace." Council meeting from 10 to 4. We did good work, however. It is terrible how many who should know better seem quite pleased with the terms. She followed the treaty debates with interest, excoriating in her diaries those who were pro-treaty. She said Griffith gave a very unimpressive speech. She went to the Dáil to hear the anti-treaty debates, especially the women's speeches. She said on December 21st, heard Duggan, horrible speech with reference to dead, which hurt the living. Then Rutledge spoke clear and well. Heard Miss McSweeney spoke for 1.5 hours and wiped the floor with Cosgrave and all the opponents. And just a little ad, there will be a biography of Mary McSweeney out in the next few months by UCD Press, who also published Kathleen Lynn. On December 22nd, she wrote, "Dáil postponed till January 3rd. Is it good for us? I hope so. All say Miss McSweeney's speech was epoch-making. We trust and pray now as always." But of course, her hopes were dashed, and the treaty was passed. She says on the 10th of January, "Alas, the day that sees Griffin in Dev's place and all of our people out of the Dáil, which is no Dáil now, only an instrument of England. Dick Mulcahy in Brua's place, and they behave so insultingly. Not a woman left in the Dáil. However, Madame Markovich was in this morning with cheering news. We are strong and will be stronger for missing the self-seekers. Barton is with us, I'm glad. God save Ireland." On the 6th of February, she was cheering Cumann Amon, who rejected the treaty in the majority. Both herself and French-Mullen were anti-treaty and involved in the Republican side in the Civil War. She actually was active in the Waterford-Kilkenny area for a few months after the Battle of Dublin as the fight moved down to the so-called Munster Republic. And once the anti-treaty forces were driven back into Tipperary, Limerick, and then Kerry, she returned to Dublin. But her house, their house in Ranelagh, was always being raided by the National Army. She keeps giving out about the Republicans and the new government. She was not in prison during the war, and she ran for election as an anti-treaty candidate and was elected. She says, 8 a.m. on the 30th of August 1923, "Milkman at the door told me I was elected. God grant me grace to do the right by my country. Very nice day with patience. We do well this evening, 25 Republicans elected. Chuck Ultan, St. Ultan's, very busy, etc., etc." Like all those who were anti-treaty, she did not take her seat. And indeed, she never sat in the Dáil because she lost her seat in 1927. Like many politically active women, she was more involved at a local level, actually, especially on matters of public health in local government and on education and housing, and served on the Rathmines Urban District Council until 1930. She commented regularly on public health, particularly housing and the tenements, which were, she said, unfit for any habitation, and on disease prevention. As a council member of the Irish White Cross, she endeavoured to help Republicans and was very critical of the newly formed Irish Free State's attitude to anti-treatyites, many of whom were dealing with joblessness, poverty and trauma. All her life, she remained committed, however, to the central focus, St. Ultan's, and to children, and the right of children to proper healthcare and education. At St. Ultan's, she fostered international research, and you see you here holding children, and Madeleine holding children, I think, and there's a goat. They had a herd of goats at this stage. She fostered international research on tuberculosis eradication, and in 1937, through the efforts of her colleague Dorothy Stopford Price, the hospital introduced the BCG inoculation to prevent TB. She also encouraged links with the US and continental medical practitioners, and ffrench-Mullen and Lynn visited both the US and Europe many times to raise funds for St. Ultan's, but also to visit paediatric units there and see the latest innovation in infant and early child healthcare. Her child-centred dealing with children was furthered in 1934 when Maria Montessori came, and she campaigned for the amalgamation of St. Ultan's and Harcourt Street to form the National Children's Hospital in 1934. Of course, that didn't happen. And that didn't happen because of the opposition of the Catholic Church and the Catholic medical doctors. You have to remember that both St. Ultan's and Harcourt Street were secular women-run hospitals. And the Catholic Church, which ran most of the other hospitals, did not want, particularly the Archbishop of Dublin. It wasn't John Charles McQuaid, we can blame another Archbishop, it was Edward Byrne, allowed Lynn to come in and make her argument, but would not agree to the amalgamation, even though they had a beautiful drawing by Michael Scott of the new hospital. It would have stretched from Charlemont Street Bridge up to Hurls Cross Bridge, all along the canal there. They bought up all the land there, and they were ready to go and create a National Children's Hospital in which there were paediatric units, there were TB units. She was also a great believer in sunshine, so there would be open air units when the sun was shining and where the children would be taken out and allowed to play. There would be playrooms. There was all sorts of wonderful things to be included in this new National Children's Hospital. But Archbishop Byrne, with his right-hand man, Father John Charles McQuaid, then of Blackrock College, put paid to that and saw off the amalgamation. And indeed, John Charles becomes the founder of the Children's Hospital in Crumlin subsequent to that. And of course, we're still waiting for a National Children's Hospital, which I hope will, in restorative justice, will be called after Dr. Kathleen Lynn. And I call out again that does happen. But Lynn battled on despite those losses against child poverty, which she and ffrench-Mullen railed against in publication. So much so that the Irish press asked in 1935, "Can you wonder that Dr. Kathleen Lynn, after years of patient, unselfish toil at times, despairs of the work she and her associates are performing and asks herself, what's the use?" But she never gave up, professionally or politically. She opposed the 1937 Constitution because of its articles on women. And indeed, it was not passed in Dublin, which people don't realise. The women were very active in Dublin, not nationwide, because the feminist movement had declined a bit by then, but they actually managed to defeat it in Dublin, in the Dublin vote, and Dev was very, very cross with them. She set up a new paediatric unit in St. Ultan's, and after the war, she set up, Second World War, she set up, became vice president of Save the German Children, an organisation which located homes for German children in Ireland. She continued to work as a doctor until the spring of 1955, when she was 80 years old. She and ffrench-Mullen were also committed to, sorry, I can give you the diaries, committed to healthy outdoor living, relishing the health-giving benefits of fresh air. They were involved with An Oige, and Lynn had her cottage in Glenmalure in County Wicklow. Here. I want to talk a little bit about their relationship, because it's important to note the private and public relationship between Lynn and ffrench-Mullen. Lynn was the chief doctor in St. Ultan's. Madeleine was the chief administrator and fundraiser. But they were also partners in life and partners in work. Already established campaigners for the right to vote, the women met in 1914, sometime between 1913 and 14, either in the soup kitchen or at a Cumann first aid. They moved in together certainly by 1915 and lived at 9 Belgrave Road in Rathmines until Madeleine's death in 1944. From 1913 until that 1944, they shared a personal and political life. Roy Foster describes their relationship in his book, Vivid Faces, their 30-year relationship, as having all the hallmarks of a marriage. And indeed, the extracts from the diaries show this. Not a day goes by that she doesn't mention MFFM, which is how she refers to her in the diary. When Madeleine is away, she said, "So lonely without Madeleine, I miss her at every turn." And then in 1926, she said, "The birds are beautiful and poor Madeleine is missing them." 1926, she says, "Madeleine's birthday tomorrow. We're living together nearly 11 years now. DG. Deo gratias. Thank God." There's also more, they don't speak about the intimacy of their relationship in the diary, but you can see elements of it there, particularly around events like birthdays, Christmas, important times of the year. In 1921, the 28th of January, very mild, she says, Madeleine grüßt, which is greet in German. They were both German-philes, so they loved the German language and literature and their German terms throughout the diaries. And this is the night before her birthday. Madeleine kissed me as the clock struck late last night. I would think this is a reference to intimacy between the two women. She talks about Madeleine very tired and resting this afternoon. Madeleine always had very ill health. Madeleine's death then comes of a bit of a shock in 1944, even though she had been very, very sick. But I find these extracts around the time of Madeleine's death and after very impactful in terms of the emotional inner life of Kathleen Lynn and her relationship with Madeleine. Madeleine had gone to a rest home but died quite suddenly. And she talks about the funeral. She said it was a beautiful day, got some wee flowers in the garden and a bunch of yellow roses and went and said goodbye to the earthly Madeleine ffrench-Mullen, MFFM. And then sat there a while in the stillness. The yellow roses make the coffin so sweet. And then later on she talks about, very nice of M leaving me her money to me. Dear M, it will be an added responsibility, but I will make it good. And for years, then the next 10 years, she talks about ensuring that money is used in St. Ultan's. At the funeral itself, she talked about the fact that everybody commiserated with her and not with Madeleine's family, the ffrench-Mullens, because they were each other's important person. And then she says one of the relatives of ffrench-Mullen came up to her and said, "She was our relation, but she was always yours." So again, these are these hints of the acceptance by the wider public as well that Madeleine and Kathleen were a couple. She said then later on, when she came back after visiting her sister, after Madeleine died, she went away for a couple of weeks, and she said, coming back to the house, they shared the loneliness of coming back with no MFFM to greet me and say what a barren wilderness it had been while I was away. However, Kathleen kept on working. She committed to St. Ultan's. She ensured that Madeleine's money was spent well in St. Ultan's, and she kept working up to a few months before she herself died in September 1955. And she was buried with full military honours in Dean's Grange Cemetery, and as you can see, they're passing St. Ultan's with her nurses out to honour her. Detailed explorations of lives like this, a life of service lived by Lynn, gives us a broader awareness of, as Helena Maloney said, the ability of women to embrace an ideal, to do so from her own historical and socio-political and cultural experiences. It was not some man who led Lynn into the revolution or into socialism or into her medical practice. She developed those ideas herself. And we have to recognise that women come to their own ideological ideas. You can see Lynn going from the soft unionist to the committed Republican, to the committed medical professional, to the radical partner of Madeleine French-Mullen. With opening of new archives, and especially with digital access to archives, scholars are delving deeply and producing more nuanced analysis of the roles and contributions of women to suffrage, nationalism, trade union activism, and their broader contributions to the revolutionary period. So these biographies are very important. And last, I will say, they are being honoured. This is a plaque that was unveiled a couple of years ago in Charlemont Street in what's now a hotel to Madeleine and Kathleen. So they're together on the plaque. And I would argue we need to have, again, the new hospital named after Dr. Kathleen Lynn. It's a good ring to it. The Dr. Kathleen Lynn Children's Hospital. Thank you very much.